Our second reading this morning comes from the Gospel of Matthew. I'm going to be reading from the Contemporary English Version. When Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, he went to Galilee. But instead of staying in Nazareth, Jesus moved to Capernaum. This town was beside the lake Galilee, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. So God's promise came true, just as the prophet Isaiah had said. Listen, lands of Zebulun and Naphtali, lands along the road to the sea and the east of the Jordan. Listen, Galilee, land of the Gentiles. Although your people live in darkness, they will see a bright light. Although they live in the shadow of death, light will shine on them. Then Jesus started preaching, turn back to God. The kingdom of heaven will soon be here. While Jesus was walking along the shore of Lake Galilee, he saw two brothers. One was Simon, also known as Peter, and the other was Andrew. They were fishermen, and they were casting their net into the lake. Jesus said to them, "Come with me, I will teach you how to bring in people instead of fish." Right then, the two brothers dropped their nets and went with him. Jesus walked along until he saw James and John, the sons of Zebedee. They were in a boat with their father, mending their nets. And Jesus asked them to come with him too. Right away, they left the boat and their father and went with Jesus. And Jesus went all over Galilee, teaching in the Jewish meeting houses and preaching the good news about God's kingdom. And that's the word of God for all God's people. When I was first getting to know my wife, Amy, I was amazed at how fearless she was as a skier. She was learning to ski about the same time as she was learning to walk. And so I was somewhat surprised when she confessed to me that she was afraid of elevators. You'd think there'd be a transfer of skill sets. And then I had to tell her that my childhood fear was going to school. That's right, I was afraid to go to school, terrified. Then after high school, college, and 3 graduate degrees, my parents were afraid that I'd never get out of school. So in spite of all the times that we heard our parents say, "Honey, there's nothing to be afraid of," fear was our constant companion. Fear of the dark, fear of what was under the bed, fear of the mean dogs in the neighbor's yard. There was an old abandoned house in the woods that you were sure was haunted. And to this day, I can't sit through a horror film. Then, when we were all grown up, our fears grew up with us. Howard Thurman, who was a great spiritual teacher, calls fear the hound of hell that dogs us, so to speak, anytime we think about the future, or about growing old, or about getting sick, or maybe even about life itself. Fear, says Thurman, is ready to spring into action as soon as you're alone, when the lights go out, or your defenses are down. I've learned that fear has become a marketable commodity. You know the show, The Fear Factor? This is a show where, for your entertainment and for advertising dollars, you can watch contestants face their prime fears by enduring terrifying stunts. And if they win, they get a fabulous prize. And you and I know that fear has lately become a political strategy. We're living in a climate of fear that's been created by a president and an administration that has used fear to gain power and control over us. It's fear that divides us. It makes us afraid to practice our freedom of speech and assembly, to host immigrants who themselves perhaps escaped a climate of fear to make a life here. It's all a part of a plan by those who are greedy for power and by those who want to erode the power of our democracy. And that psalm that Chris read earlier seems to have been written in a climate of fear. The psalmist asks, "Of whom shall I be afraid?" Now, there must be a story behind that. We only catch a glimpse of it in verses 2 and 3. When evildoers assail me and devour my flesh, my adversaries and foes, they shall stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war rise up against me, yet I will be confident. The danger, an army encamps outside the walls of the city. Maybe having a siege around the city. The promise of speaking the song helped to restore the psalmist's confidence and the presence of God in real time. That was the case with my brother David. There was once a time when this psalm became a lifeline for him and his family. David was part of a medical software company, startup, and in their presence, one who they trusted turned out to be an embezzler. And when he was caught, he tried to make a deal with the federal prosecutors that involved betraying and wrongfully accusing David and some other colleagues of fraud. Then a swarm of investigators and FBI agents came into the scene, creating a climate of fear for David and for some others. And for several years, David lived under the prospect of going bankrupt because of lawyers' fees, the loss of his career, and even imprisonment. All the while professing his innocence, refusing to make a deal where he would plead guilty to some lesser charge when he kept saying, "But I didn't do anything wrong." During that awful time, our mother suggested to David that he read Psalm 27. And this he did, even to the point where when he would walk through the house alone, he would recite it, saying it out loud as a way of reassuring himself of the presence of God and the deliverance from fear. He said, I practically had that whole thing memorized. Now, fortunately, after several years, David was exonerated The charges against him were dropped. The guilty were identified and sent to prison. But as for David, he was left with the deep knowledge that faith can not only live in a climate of fear, but it can deepen. Faithful practice cannot erase the fear, but as he discovered, practicing your faith can lift you higher, as the psalmist says, as safe as on a rock. Jesus called his disciples in a climate of fear. We're so familiar with this story of Jesus beginning his ministry and calling his disciples that we forget the fear factor that was involved. We don't think about the impact of that first sentence in this passage. Now, when Jesus heard that John was arrested, think about that. John was arrested. Imagine the scene. John the Baptist being faithful to his call as a prophet, preaching and baptizing out in the wilderness, clothed in the garment of a prophet, the cloak of camel's hair and a leather belt around his waist. And then Herod's enforcement squad comes, and they are dressed in the garment of the empire. Just enough gear to frighten and intimidate. People scatter, some of them screaming, some standing firm, calling out to the officers, "Let him go. What's the charge? What has he done? Why is he being arrested?" Sedition is all they say. While they put John in chains and shackles and carry him off to Herod's dungeon. What happens now? What happens is that Jesus arrives on the scene to continue John's work. The good news of God's coming reign is interrupted, but it is not silenced. Now, Jesus might have been tempted to hide out in the crisis. He might have made a choice to let fear decide his future. Instead, he decides that the climate of fear is the right time to begin his ministry. In the climate of fear, in the midst of a climate of fear, at its height, he starts calling his disciples. You can hear the echo of John the Baptist in his message. Kingdom of heaven is coming near. Turn your attention towards it. My friends, this is the time of year each year when we're invited to review one of the gospel stories about the beginning of Jesus' ministry. To remember him calling his first disciples, so that I believe we can review our own call to discipleship. And this year, we are called to follow Jesus in an expanding climate of fear. What we learn from the psalmist and from our families, and perhaps through people of faith, that faith can live and even grow stronger in a climate of fear. It is the faith that God is our light and salvation, God will set us up on high, safe as upon a rock. But from that height, we can see all the ways that people in a climate of fear are fulfilling their calling as citizens and disciples. And some are even have fulfilled that calling, people like Alex and Renee, who have lost their lives trying to protect their neighbors from violence. So here we sit at home, South Broadway Christian Church, wondering what might be our call. Reverend Cameron Trimble puts it this way: in times like these, courage does not always look like confrontation. Sometimes it means preserving what makes life worth saving. It takes courage and confidence in the one who is our light and salvation to refuse to decide, to let fear decide who you will become and what your future will be. The invitation, Cameron says, is to become a place of memory, of shelter, and moral clarity. Think of it. Becoming a place of shelter, memory, and moral clarity. I think I'm hearing a call to discipleship in those words. What about you?